So I'm going to put together some audio. I had forgotten to put audio in with this screencast, so I'm actually reload this, and I'm going to try to narrate what I'm going to be doing here. Let me sort of go back to the beginning. So this is our introduction to Angular. I ended up going over some stuff with WebSockets. Let me just move this ahead a little bit. So I ended up creating a blank repository here. And one of the things that I'm going to end up doing is actually bringing in a module called Browser Sync, which I think sort of connects pretty well with WebSockets in the sense that it ends up using a WebSocket. To work, in essence, there's going to be files that end up changing on the server. And since we are connected to a browser, it's going to end up updating our browser. So here I'm bringing in browser sync, saving it. I'm saving it as dependency. This is going to end up loading. And again, it's one of those things where if you just have sort of a static application that you're changing JavaScript files on, you want to see the results pretty fast, it'll work pretty well. I'm going to open up Vim here. Bring this in. Here I'm zooming in on a little bit. So the only module that I ended up bringing in here at this point was Browser Sync. And again, just so you have a little familiarity with it, I'm also going to bring in this, created an index.html file. And in here, I'm just going to put in some simple HTML. So the goal is that when I end up changing this, when I end up loading this file in a browser, when I make changes to it on the server, the browser ends up updating. And it's doing it with the use of WebSockets, which Browser Sync ends up using. So I'm going into my node modules. I installed Browser Sync. And I'm going to go in, I'm going to find Browser Sync. So this ends up getting installed under my node modules. Here's Browser Sync. In the bin directory, there's the file that I'm going to use, and I'm going to start Browser Sync. And I'm also going to start the server. So what this does is that this is going to actually open up a browser. And the page that it's going to return by default, and this is just the way that Browser Sync works, and some of these other simple servers, it's going to look for a file called index.html. And so if I move this on the screen, I'll see my hello file. And what I'm going to try to do here, now this is not going to work initially, but I'll come back and explain why. If I modify this hello file, what I'm hoping for is that it will upload, it'll basically send out a WebSocket request and cause the browser to reload. Again, this is something sort of helpful where I'm sort of saving myself from having to do a reload. And here I'm actually showing that the web server itself is nothing all that dramatic. In fact, it's basically just sort of setting up this kind of static route where I can access any files that are here. And I'm not using Express or anything for this example, and this kind of makes Browser Sync kind of nice. When you're using it with Express and you're restarting your server, there's a couple of other things you have to be aware of. So here, if I make this change, I'm not seeing this update. And the reason I'm not seeing it is that I have to actually say to Browser Sync, hey, look, I want you to watch some files. So here I'm saying this is the file flag, so S is for server, and for files I'm saying, hey, look at index.html. If it changes, send out a socket request from the server and automatically, refresh my browser. So now if I end up running this, this command is going to be watching this particular file. And let me move this along a little bit. So here, the only thing that I want to do is actually take this command, and I'm going to end up putting it in my package JSON file. And the reason why I don't put it under start is that when I deploy, if I was going to go and deploy this app, there's a npm start that will end up running automatically if this is here. And I don't want this to run if I end up deploying it. So that what I'll often do is end up doing start dev. So in my development environment, I'm going to be using browser sync. Obviously, if this is deployed, you wouldn't want to use browser sync. So I basically just copied and pasted this command in here. In which case now, if I end up doing npm run, npm run will show you all the commands you can use, and now I know that I've got this start dev, and I'll run it. And at this point, I'll have a browser connected, and now if I go back and I end up making changes to my file, I'll see the changes. So let me actually bring in a couple things here. So really we want to create an Angular app. That's what our game plan is. And I'm just sort of showing you browser sync as something that you might end up running into at some point. Here are my dependencies. I'm bringing in Angular and I'm bringing in Bootstrap. And I'm going to bring them right into this file. Again, I'm using browser sync, which is creating this sort of static, this server that will return static files. So I'm going to bring in files for both Bootstrap and Angular. So here's my, I'm going to go into my node modules because that's where this ended up getting installed. And here's my Bootstrap. And I'm going to bring this in here. Again, if we were setting up Express, we would have to actually set up static routes in order to do this. And I'll run my npm run start dev again. And if I load this up, you'll see that at least it is using the fonts from Bootstrap. And if I go and change this file here, and I'm going to go in, now I'm going to bring in Angular as well. So Angular is just right under Angular. And here, just to show you the concepts of Angular, we can show it to you without actually creating an Express application. Again, the browser sync stuff is just some exposure. Don't get too hung up on it. If you don't want to use it, don't use it. There's another module called HTTP server, which will end up doing, which will load up a server for you where you can serve your files just as easily. So here I'm just checking, and initially I think I had a problem with Angular not showing up there. So I'm just going to take a look. I think I'm going to restart my server here. And eventually I'll get this to show up where, again, if the Angular is, if it's finding that Angular file, you'll have this Angular object. And this is always my sanity check to see that Angular ended up getting loaded. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically create an Angular application by putting in this app.js file. And I'll bring it in here. So I've got my app.js file. And I'll put an alert up here. And again, without even reloading, you'll see that this ends up popping up. Again, that's the browser sync magic. And one of the things that I want to do here is that I wanted to actually look at this other file as well. So in fact, if I do change this app file, I want it to reload as well. Again, you could ignore some of this stuff if you're not going to use browser sync. Again, there's another module called HTTP server that will, load these files just as easily without browser sync. So now if I end up making this change, I'll see that that'll pop up without reloading. Get rid of it. Now it'll reload and it won't pop up. So there's a couple of packages that people use to do this sort of thing. There's browser sync and there's live reload. But now let's actually focus on Angular. And so what we're going to do is we're going to end up creating an Angular application. The way that you end up creating an Angular application is by using the Angular module. Very critical that you put in a second parameter here. If you don't, it's going to think that this module ends up existing. So here I'm creating this module. The name of my module is going to be app. And if we have this variable, we could console log that we end up having, in fact, this application. So one sort of sanity check that I'll end up doing for an Angular application is to actually see that Angular is going to be working. And so here what I'm doing is that you always want to bootstrap your Angular application. So we created this Angular module called app. We passed in that second parameter, which is the empty array. And at this point, my sort of sanity check is to actually put in an Angular expression. So you could think about Angular as being part of Angular is a templating engine that's on the client. And what's going to happen is that when Angular ends up loading, it's going to look for these braces and it's going to evaluate them as Angular expressions. So if in fact Angular is loaded, and it should be because I have both Angular, I've created an Angular module called app, what I should be able to do is to put an expression. And these are very simple expressions. We'll find out we'll be using scope for these sort of things, but if you look, you'll see that you don't see the braces. You see the 100 show up here, so it actually ended up doing this calculation for me. And again, a big part of Angular is to basically, make your DOM. Your DOM basically is something that can get modified anyway. And when it's in memory, you can change it. But Angular is going to give you control over the DOM so that you can do a lot of interesting things. Now, this won't work because, again, you can't really do anything really fancy within these braces. In fact, one of the things you'll see in one of the reviews is you can't declare a function in here either, but you can do simple things like concatenating some words. And again, this is not something you're going to do, but this just tells me, hey, look, in fact, Angular is recognizing that I have an application called app, and I know this because I'm not seeing those braces and I'm not seeing any errors in here. You can see that my DOM is actually getting changed dynamically with Angular. If I view my source code, I'll see in my source code, I see the braces, but again, Angular is modifying the DOM. The Angular application is getting bootstrapped, and what ends up happening when it ends up getting bootstrapped, it goes into the DOM, and it will end up evaluating any of these Angular expressions. Again, it's important you'll realize that it doesn't evaluate these things constantly. There are certain events which end up causing this to happen, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a little bootstrap to create a container, and I'll put some text here. And we're going to start looking at what we're really going to focus on, which is Angular. And in particular, we're going to look at Angular controllers. So here's our to-do list. And I'm going to create a div here. And here's where you're going to start seeing all these things where you see the NG. These are things that Angular is looking for, and Angular is going to modify the DOM based upon what it finds. These are actually Angular directives. And this directive says that I'm going to be creating an Angular controller. And Angular is going to attempt to create a controller. The problem is it's not going to find a controller because we never created one, and you'll get this message. So it's saying, look, I don't know what this is, right? You're telling me that there is a controller called to-do control, but I can't find it. And it tells you, I expect this control to be a function, and I can't find it, so it ends up throwing this exception. This is a fairly common error to get, and you have to realize why you're getting it, because Angular is not able to find that. So now we could go back here, and let's actually create that controller. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my application. So Angular allows you to basically say, look, here's your module, create a controller. There's two parts to this function. There is the name of the controller, which is how Angular is going to find it, and there's a function. And the function is going to end up getting called every time you end up creating this controller. So here we could end up putting in a function, and we'll end up getting this to work. So here's our function, and now if we go back, we'll see that error is going to disappear. We're not really doing anything. This wouldn't really make sense for a controller because nothing is really happening. But let's see how we could get some data from our controller. And before we do that, let's actually see that this is getting called, right? We can see we don't have an error, but let's actually see that we're seeing this, I got called. And we see it. And what's important to note is that if we use this controller multiple times in our application, every time that we use it, that controller function is going to end up getting called. It's going to get called for every single instance of that controller. It's very important to make that distinction. So here you see that this ends up getting called twice. And let's actually just make it even more clear by just outputting a random number here. So we can use a math object. And if we do that, we'll see two random numbers that end up showing up. So again, the important thing is to realize is that for every time you end up utilizing this controller, this function will get called. And if you do declare, if you use the directive for ng controller, you're going to have to make sure that you do have a controller function that will get called. You're going to make sure that you ended up declaring a controller by having your application and calling .controller. So, eventually, one of the things that you'll always end up doing with a controller is that you're going to want to pass data to the controller. So how do you do it? Well, if we end up putting a variable in here called scope, and we'll see this, that Angular is using something called dependency injection. Not critical right now, but we'll realize pretty soon that, how this works. Basically, just by naming a parameter here, and there's any number of parameters we could put in. If Angular recognizes that parameter, it'll supply a value for it. If it doesn't recognize that parameter, you're in trouble because it will end up throwing an exception. So it ends up doing this with something called dependency injection. I mean, in essence, it's basically sort of reading the parameters of the function, and it's saying, do I know what a scope is? And if it is, it's going to create a scope. And a scope really is nothing more than an object. If we end up doing a console.log and output the scope, we'll find out that it's an object that has some properties to it. In fact, we've got two controllers, so we've got two scopes. Each controller gets its own scope. When you ask for the scope, it gives you a new scope object. So the scope is what we end up using to basically pass data from our controller to our view, right? We're instantiating a controller within our view, and what we're going to do now is we're going to pass some data to it. So here's our controller. Let's actually just use one of these now. And what we're going to use is we're going to assume that Angular knows about something called a foo. And Angular is going to be fairly kind because if in fact we don't have if it has no idea what this foo is, it doesn't throw an exception. It doesn't really do anything. It just says, that's fine. You want me to output the foo, right, because it sees those braces. but it's perfectly content not to error out. It says, well, that's okay. I'm not going to error this thing out. There's no foo, so there's nothing to show. Well, how do we set this value? Scope is just a regular object, so we could say to the scope, hey, look, foo is equal to bar. Or let's actually do math.random, so we could make this dynamic. And now we see that it actually displays this value for foo. Here, let's actually do this twice or 3 times. And you could say, again, the key here, and it's very, very important to note, is that you get 3 random values. So the way that data gets passed from the controller to the view is through the scope. And we'll find out the way that data ends up coming back from the view is also going to be through the scope. So here, let's make things a little bit more interesting. Let's create some objects. Eventually, in the next workshop, we'll end up getting this data from the server, but for now, we're going to create a couple of very simple to-do objects with an ID and a name. And an ID and a name. And we're putting this on the scope, and it's going to be available in our view. We'll get rid of these other ones. And let's see what happens here. So this is on our scope, and we can see that we can output this data. So the bottom line is that you have the ability to pass data from your controller to your view. Again, for the most part, this is not going to be hard-coded data. You're going to make a call up to your server to get the data that you want to pass, and you'll end up passing it down through the scope. The scope is, critical in terms of using your controllers. And here again, it's just giving us a visual representation of that data. We're probably not going to want to output the data like that, but better we end up putting it in some sort of decent format. So if we did this, we have the ability to create this well. And what we're going to do here is look at the concept of another directive, which is a repeat directive. So how do we loop over something? All templating engines give us the opportunity to repeat, like Swig does, Angular does as well. So here, we're going to repeat, and the ng repeat is what it's basically going to do is for every item that we end up repeating over, it's going to stamp out a new well for us. That's the way to sort of think about it. And so what we can do here is that we can say, and the syntax is to do in, and as long as you have to-dos on the scope, it should give us another well. Again, it's stamping this out for each to-do that we have. So now we've got 2 wells here. So it's important to note that when you end up putting this on an element, again, it's the div itself that's repeating. That well is going to repeat twice for each to-do that we have. In fact, one of the things that we'll see is that when it ends up doing this, you actually will get another scope. You don't really see it, but internally you'll get another scope where you can access that individual to-do object within this repeat. So here, if we go in here, we could look at the to-do, and we could look at the name. And these are really, the interesting part about this is that these are sort of these living objects as long as the browser is here, as long as this controller ends up existing. So you have the, what we've looked at up to this point, we've looked at ng-app, which bootstraps our application, ng-controller allows us to use a controller, ng-repeat, which allows us to repeat over information that we have available from within the scope. I'm going to go and put this in maybe a little bit of a nicer format here. But these are all fall under the category of Angular directives. So let's modify this, and we'll do a list item. So again, it's the list item that's going to end up getting repeated. Let's give this a class name of list group item. And let's give this a UL. We'll give this a class of list group. Fix that. So again, not all that much is going to change. I mean, we're still looping over this, but instead of these being separate wells, right, these are going to be two list group items. And so again, when these end up getting sort of stamped out, that to-do is available. And it's actually considered a child scope of this parent scope. Again, it's not something, for the most part, that you have to be too concerned with. But it does actually exist, and that's what's, allowing this this functionality. So again, we're sort of, Angular is giving us the ability to create this templating engine, and one of the things that we'll see is that this, unlike a Swig template engine, this is actually a template engine where things are alive in the sense that we've got these to-dos that we could end up changing. So now we've got these two to-dos that are on our page. And one of the things that we want to take a look at is how we can end up going and modifying them. So again, if you think about how this would be done in jQuery, this would be sort of a tricky business, right? I mean, we'd have to find the element that we'd want to append to. We'd have to find, do a selector. We'd have to create a list item. We'd have to set the class name of that list item. We'd have to set the HTML by looping over the to-dos. And with Angular, it's more declarative, where you're not actually manually going in and creating the DOM items, but Angular is doing it for you. I mean, under the covers, there still is, this DOM manipulation that's going on here. But again, you don't really have to be, you don't have to worry about it. You're basically just focused on setting your properties on your models and letting Angular do the work for you. So here, let's put in, this sort of will sort of tie things up a little bit. If we end up, now what we want to do is we want to put a button here, and when we click on this button, we want to remove our to-do. The question is, how do we go about doing that? Well, it turns out that there's a, well, here, we'll actually just set this up a little bit, pull that to the right, and fix our CSS a little bit. And what we want to do here is that when this button gets clicked on, we want to remove this to-do. So now we want to go in the other direction. We want to go from the view up to the controller. And Angular gives us a couple of different ways to do this. So one of the things that we could end up doing is that there's another attribute, an Angular attribute that we could end up using. It's actually an Angular directive. And the Angular directive is called an ng-click. And what you end up doing is you end up specifying, hey, look, this is what you want to have happen when this button is clicked on. And you do that with, again, all these ng dashes. These are all called directives. That's something that we're going to end up covering later on. But for the most part, if you want your button to do something back in the controller, you end up doing ng-click. And what this ends up doing is that this is going to, let's assume that we have some destroy method back in the controller. This would end up getting called. And again, Angular is very nice about this. If this destroy doesn't exist, which it doesn't at the moment, it's not going to get angry at you and throw an exception or throw an error. It's just going to say, well, that's fine. I'm not going to do anything about it. There's no destroy on the scope, but I'm also not going to throw any errors as well. Let's try to get that to get called. So in some respects, Angular is kind of kind to you by not throwing these exceptions, but in other ways, you could look at this and say, well, this isn't working, but there's no error that ends up getting thrown. Of course, you will get errors if you do things like try to access a controller that doesn't exist. That will end up throwing exceptions. Let's go back to our app. And here we are in our controller now. Again, if we want this to get called, we have to put it on the scope. You can't just put it inside the controller. It's got to be on the scope in order for this to be accessible. So when you want to send stuff down to the view, right, or to the HTML, you end up doing it by putting it on the scope. And if you want to call something back in the controller, you end up doing it by putting it on the scope as well. So here we have our scope object. Again, this ends up getting injected here. And, this is kind of interesting. If we go and remove that, Angular is not going to know what that is, and it's going to throw an exception. So you can't just put whatever you want to in here. And it's not like the first parameter is always the scope. Again, Angular does dependency injection, and based on what the names of those parameters are, that's the object that you're going to be getting. And Angular has to know how to create that object. If you don't do that, it's not going to know what this is. And you see it says, I don't know what scope provider is. It's looking for something that can provide a scope, and it can't find it, so it ends up throwing that exception. There's other things that can be passed here as well. One of the things that we'll be using is going to be the HTTP object to make a call to the server. That's something you end up using in the workshop, in which case you could end up accessing that as well. So again, if you're injecting something within the your controller function, it has to be something that Angular knows about. And again, it's not the order that matters. The order is irrelevant. It's just going to be that it understands what this thing is called. We're going to be creating our own things that could get injected, our own services that could get injected, but this will work because Angular knows what HTTP is, and the order is irrelevant. If we switch the order, this is still going to work. Same thing. So again, it's not the order, it's going to be the names of these arguments. And the second it sees something it doesn't recognize, it's going to end up throwing an exception. So now, what we want to do is that since we want to destroy this, we're going to need to put a destroy method on the scope. And if we do that, we can go and do an alert just to see that that's getting called. So we see that that gets called. But let's actually pass back. So one of the things we could do, again, we have our own scope that's in here. And one of the things we could do is we could say, hey, look, we want to pass back this item that we were looping over. And so now if we pass that in here, we could log it out, and we'll see that we can access either item, right? And here, the reason why that's happening is that I think I'm using the wrong variable, not item, but to do is what I call this because, again, I did a repeat with a to do. I could call it whatever I want in here. That's going to be irrelevant. But here's my bar, and here's my foo. You'll notice that there's some extra parameters that are on here. You have this hash key, and that's how Angular is actually keeping track of what's in this list. It's not something that you have to worry about, but we'll find out that if you have two items that are the same, Angular might not like it all that much. So we could actually just rename this so maybe it reads a little bit better. And what we're going to do here is we're going to find the index of the item that got clicked on. And again, the reason why you could do this is that these are living objects. This to-dos is an array that exists. Angular is keeping track of it. and we could find the index of the item that we are sending back to destroy. And we're only doing this in memory. Every time our page reloads, we're going to get our items back. If this were happening in a database, we would find a way to go and delete them on the server. And when we do that, that's going to be asynchronous. But for now, what we can do is find out the index, and eventually what we'll do is that we'll look at our scope, we'll look at our to-dos objects, and we'll splice it at that index. So in essence, what that's going to do is that that'll end up removing this to-do. So here we could take our to-dos, we could splice at this index. And what'll happen is our to-do will end up going away, right? So the key thing is how exactly does Angular do this? How does it go about doing this? And the fact is that Angular ends up running through what's called a digest cycle. And the way that the digest cycle works is that, because again, it's not like it's sitting in the background and just constantly going and watching the scope. It doesn't do that. You'd have all kinds of memory issues if that happened. But when there are certain events that happen, like user interactions, what'll end up happening is that Angular will go and say, all right, well, I'm going to see if your scope ended up changing, and it's going to redraw things based on your scope. So here, you can actually see that here we have two different controllers, and we've actually got two different sets of to-dos. So again, just another way of sort of seeing that every time you end up using this controller, it's basically instantiating a new controller when you end up using that ng controller. And so what I was talking about before is that, again, it's not like Angular is sitting there and running some clock and saying, okay, did these scope values change? I need to change the DOM. But when the user ends up clicking on a button, Angular goes, oh, wait a second, let me see if anything changed. And if anything changed, it ends up basically running what's called a digest cycle. So what we'll do here is now we're going to go and see this in action again, but we'll actually see how we can end up adding some to-do items here. So we'll do form group, put an input control here. Give this a class of form control. And this is something else that we're going to not necessarily cover in this workshop, but show you how you can actually send data back to the server from form controls. So what I want to do here is I want to now put a new to-do item here. And so I'm going to want to set up an ng-click in order to do that. And we've seen that already. We can do an ng-click, and we can end up sending some data back to the controller. So if we do an ng-click and we specify that we want to have some method called create here, we could end up doing that. And again, no error, even though we don't have a create method. Again, Angular's kind that way. So make sure that you're actually spelling things correctly, that you're putting it on the scope. You don't want to put every function on the scope. It's only functions that you're basically going to be calling from the front. Now we could click on this and we could see that this alert ends up showing up. So the question is, how do we get that text box? We don't really want to use just regular jQuery or document get element by ID. Angular is going to make this a little bit easier for us. So one of the directives that we could end up using here is that there's a directive called ngModel. And what ngModel will end up doing is that if we put ngModel on a form field, what it'll end up doing is that when you start typing in the form field, it'll put on your scope that model. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put an ngModel on here, and we're going to give this ngModel a name of name, because this is going to be the name of our to-do object. So this is kind of an interesting thing here. So with this ngModel directive, we can go in here and we could specify that what we're doing is we're putting an NG model. So what this does is it's dynamically going to put something on the scope. So if we do console.log here, and we look at the scope and where we didn't have any value for name before, when we start typing in that field, it's actually going to say, all right, I'm going to look on the scope, and I'm going to put on the scope I'm going to attach to the scope name, and the value that I'm going to give it is the value what the user ended up putting into the text box. So what we should see is that if we put some data in the text box and we click on create, we should see that name happening here. So we put this in and we click on it, and we could see that as we click on it, it goes back. I mean, it's kind of interesting. If you don't, this maybe is not shown here, but if you don't end up starting to type in the text field, you're not going to end up getting that value. But this is kind of a cool thing, and this is kind of the first demo that people do with Angular, is that here, if I put name down here, again, nothing shows up, but the second I start typing in here, you see it basically echoing here. And again, the bottom line is that when I start typing, since I didn't have a value on the scope for name, when I start typing, it does actually put the value in, and that value will just end up echoing. So by putting this form field here and putting an NG model, we're actually dynamically able to put data on the scope that we're going to end up getting from user input, and then when we end up creating a to-do, we're going to be able to basically push it on our to-do stack. And again, the Angular's digest cycle is automatically going to end up running after click events, and what's going to happen when that happens is that since our to-dos ended up changing, we'll see the third item showing up here the same way that when we end up removing them, we see them going away. One of the things we could also do is that it maybe doesn't make sense to have a to-do without a name. So Angular is going to end up giving us a fairly easy way of disabling this to-do button when in fact the user hasn't given any value. So we'll end up looking at that. There's another directive that we can end up using called ng disabled. So here, if we end up doing that, one of the things we could do is that on our button, if you sort of think about this, it's a little tricky at first, but we could put ng disabled. So again, that's an attribute that Angular understands, and it's going to disable this button when? Well, let's specify that, hey, look, when we don't have a name, we want to disable that button. So when name is not on the scope, or even when name is an empty string, because an empty string will end up evaluating to something falsy, this button is going to be disabled. And if we end up switching back to our HTML, we'll see that that's the case. So all of these things are Angular attributes that we're using. When this reloads, you could see we can't click on this button. But if we end up typing some data in here, we will be able to go and actually call this and call a method that's going to eventually allow us to create another to-do. So let's take this name out. And so when I go to create, we see that we can get our scope name. So there's nothing that prevents us from actually adding a new to-do. And let's just use a little bit of reduce to get our, again, this is not Angular. This is just strictly using our reduce function. If you remember, we want to get our maximum ID. So the reduce function takes a function that's going to get passed two parameters plus a starting point. So 0 will be passed into the memo the first time this runs. And here I'm just going to say, hey, look, if the ID is greater than memo, let me reset memo. And of course, when you use reduce, and you should be comfortable with this at this point, we're going to want to return this memo object, and that'll give us our max value. So again, you should get a comfort zone with using reduce. If we do this, we have to put in a value, and we'll see that this is 2, just to sort of make sure that this is working. We'll change this first one to 7, and we should see 7 pop up. And what we're going to want to do is whatever that max value is, we're going to want to increase it by 1. So now let's push on this. We'll increase the max value, and we'll give it a name of scope.name. So again, the big takeaway here is that there's a two-way binding with the scope. And if I put a value in here, the value will show up here. I could end up adding items. And we should probably also go in here, since we're creating, reset that text field so that after we end up inserting something, that clears out. That's a little bit of a better usability. Eventually, we'll end up using a service to actually get, real data that's sitting in a database. But for now, what we're able to do is we're able to go, to the view by putting something on the scope. We're able to go back by using buttons and specifying certain functions that should end up getting called. So let's set up a separate controller. And we're going to look a little bit at the digest cycle to understand what the digest cycle. Again, the second I do this, message controller doesn't exist. And I'm going to go and create a second controller here. Again, this is going to eventually be second nature to you, but here's my control. And not my control, but message control. And I'll make that error message go away. So let's put a div in here. We'll do a little panel, and we're going to use this control to send some messages based on how we're manipulating our to-dos. So here's our header. We see that that shows up. And here we're going to have a message that's going to be the body. And what we're going to look at a couple of things here, but we're going to see how we can end up communicating between controllers. This is something that you'll end up using in the workshop. Now, here's another directive, ngIf. ngIf says, hey, look, don't show this. Only show this if, in fact, you have a message on the scope. And we don't have anything on the scope, so this goes away. The second we end up putting a message on here, this will end up showing up. So let's do something kind of interesting here. I mean, eventually we're going to end up looking at broadcasting messages from one controller to the other, so that when something happens in to-do, we can let the message controller know about it. Let's do something different. We're going to do a set timeout. We're going to wait 1 second, and let's make sure that this is firing, and we can see it ends up firing. And what we're going to do is we're going to change our model, but we're going to do it inside this set timeout. We know that this fired because we saw the alert, but even after a second, we don't see our code changing. And the reason why that happens is that Angular doesn't really know that this set timeout function fired. As far as it's concerned, it doesn't run some clock to see that the scope ended up changing. It only does it on certain events. And set timeout is not one of those events. We see actually that if we do end up removing an item, we see that that foo ends up showing up here. And again, it shows up because the digest cycles run. So you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't have to do this very often. But if we end up running scope.digest, we could force a digest cycle. Again, it's not something that you're going to have to do often. In fact, Angular gives you the ability to actually inject timeout. Timeout basically wraps around Windows timeout, but not only does it call set timeout on the window object, but it also calls the digest cycle. So you're not going to have to do this too often. If you find yourself using the digest cycle, sometimes you have to, but it's a pretty rare occurrence to do that. So again, this was just sort of a demonstration of that digest cycle. But now let's do something else. Let's actually let the message control know that something ended up changing. And we can't access the message control directly. But Angular gives us the ability to basically publish events and subscribe to events. So there's this sort of big root scope object, which is sort of the parent of all the scopes. You could sort of think about it as your global scope. And what we can do with the root scope is that we have the ability to broadcast. And if people are interested in what we have to say, they can subscribe to it. So what we can do here is that we can end up broadcasting. And we're going to broadcast. I'm going to modify this in a second, but we can basically broadcast a message. So we can do something, and let's actually just we'll keep this kind of simple. We're just going to broadcast a message. And we'll see how different scopes can subscribe to it. So we'll say destroyed to do. And over here, we'll say created to do. Now, this is not going to end up breaking anything, but no one's subscribing to it, so nothing really happens. Eventually, we're going to want to get this to show up in the message. So how do we go about doing that? Well, when something is broadcast on the root scope, other scopes have the ability to get in on it. And it's a little bit different from our pub sub, and I'll show you that in a second. But what it ends up coming down to here is that you have the ability to specify scope on some message. And let's just see what these arguments are. It's a little bit different than you might think here. So what's going to happen here, this is going to end up getting broadcast. And on this message, we'll see that there are two things that we get back here. We end up getting back this first object, which has a couple of things that are here. It's not really all that much that we're interested in, or really things that I could see here. There's some target scopes that are there. But really what we're sort of interested in is going to be the second parameter. So this is going to be what our message is. And now we could specify scope.message equals message. And so now we could see destroyed to do and created to do. So all that I'm sort of demoing here is the ability to basically communicate back and forth to different controllers. So here, let's actually make that message go away by, again, using our $sign timeout and making that message become falsy. So in 2 seconds, that'll end up going away. Again, not the greatest UI, but again, if you were going to try to do this with jQuery, there would be a heck of a lot more work that you'd have to do in order to get this to work. So you've gotten exposed to controllers. Here we're just going to go sort of quickly through a demo which talks a little bit about these things. I think it's, again, a little bit easier to understand what's happening in these slides after you see some of this stuff in action. So it'll give you a little bit of a context for, sort of where, when Angular started to kind of pop in to existence. And we'll end up going through this fairly quickly. So in terms of how this, this is showing an early view of what pages ended up looking like. People started to use all kinds of wacky animated GIFs, and that was the sort of interactivity that you had. And in essence, the web was basically brochureware. Nothing was really happening on it until you ended up getting Web 2.0 ended up coming into play. And so when we think about Web 2.0, we think about web applications that ended up becoming more like applications, right? We had, sort of single-page applications. We had user events, and basically the browser became an application platform. And building websites really and developing software sort of became the same thing when you have a lot of the logic that's happening on the client. And so in essence, the full stack developer is really building applications. And again, this is all driven by JavaScript. So when all of a sudden your client-side code ended up becoming more critical because it was mission critical for your application. It wasn't just that you'd have a typo. It was that the application wouldn't work. So initially, people were creating this kind of functionality out of the box. They were using jQuery. They were, in essence, creating their own frameworks. And this became a little bit problematic because you had to sort of understand what someone's intent was, and you could do it through jQuery, but you had to be very sort of judicious about how you used it. And people were coming up with different architectural decisions. And in essence, this is really how Angular ended up coming into be, right? So Angular ended up providing an environment with generic functionality where it established these patterns and these architects. And you can sort of see this in the code that we wrote, where it allowed us to focus on product-specific code. We could create our constructors, and the product-specific code would be like our to-do items. And so it gave us a way of suggesting a solution, right? We could just reuse the Angular functionality to create our own application. So if we end up thinking about the server and the clients, this ended up becoming really much more of a live application. And we could sort of think about how our application is set up and different pieces of our application. And what really this ended up happening with this is that our application became a lot more modular, right? We could think about having different controllers and different functionality for different parts of our application where we had this reusability. And again, we could think about these controllers as different modules within our application. And other frameworks have kind of similar concepts. I mean, React has this idea of a component. Backbone, which I haven't used in a while, has the same sort of thing. And again, different frameworks term these things differently. But in essence, we've got the ability to go and create this. This is all stuff that we've seen before. And a big takeaway here is that with Swig, when we end up creating HTML, it's not really a living document. We end up sending this stuff back from the server back to the client. And basically, when the client gets it, it's just text. So it's frozen in time. And this is not going to be a big surprise to you because we ended up I showed you this in the form of actually looking at an application. So what we can end up doing here with Angular is that if the user clicks on a new book, we could end up changing the title. And this will end up changing. And this is done through scope. So we've got this idea of Angular templates. We've got this idea of scope. The templates allow us to basically, and we didn't really use templates, but we put this right into our index.html. And if there's something on the scope, we can end up accessing it within our index file. So all of a sudden our DOM becomes this sort of living document. And that's where these Angular controllers end up coming in. And so this user interface is really a combination of our template and our scope. And our controller is what's binding these two things together. Our controller is binding these things together with our scope object. So we've got this scope, and we're able to sort of go back and forth because whatever is on our scope, we can end up changing it. If something is on our scope and it ends up changing, we'll see that change happening in the view. We can also call methods from the view up to the controller with the scope. And the scope is nothing more than a JavaScript object. We've ended up seeing this before. So here, if the user ends up clicking on a book, we tell Angular to recalculate the template. We don't really have to because, again, when the user clicks on something, Angular will go ahead and end up running this digest cycle. And for the most part, it's not something that you have to deal with, although there are times, and we will see it in the workshop, where you do have to actually tell Angular, hey, look, Angular, run your own digest cycle. Again, it's not common. If you find yourself doing this a lot, you're probably doing it unnecessarily, because Angular will automatically recalculate its template. What it'll do, if there's some user interaction, it'll end up doing it. So this gives us sort of these building blocks. So here, we have the ability to create multiple controllers. These controllers, we could think about really being able to reuse these controllers. But here we've got a situation where we've got these three controllers. Again, whenever you see the NG, that's an Angular directive. By the end of the workshop, you'd be pretty comfortable with NG app, NG controller, NG repeat. You can see how we have this one controller. We've got a nested controller within it, or actually, excuse me, two nested controllers within it. Then we're using our NG repeat to loop over these menu items. And that pretty much does it for this. Sorry I had to go through and do the audio afterwards. I hope you were able to follow along